For our last keynote presentation, please welcome Max Levchin, founder and CEO of Affirm.
Walking on a dream. How can I explain? Talking to myself. Will I see again?
Good morning. I am between you and the TSA strike, for those of you trying to get out, so I'll try to move expeditiously. So this is probably slightly unusual speech in the sense that it tries to look into the future. I'm asked fairly often, so I've been around the industry as an entrepreneur, as an investor, advisor to companies, to sort of explain how does one peer into what's coming and make sense of it and leverage it. And most recently at South by Southwest, actually, I gave this talk called 5 Unstoppable Trends that are changing the world, but I've since been able to distill it down to 3 that are relevant to online commerce and retail. And the general answer that I always give is that it's not like I can see the next company to start or invest or trend even. You just sort of try to look for a wave that is gathering up on the water when it's still a swell, an industry trend, some new technology, some new idea that's being formed before it actually becomes a wave, while it's still just a tiny little wrinkle. Jump on it, get on the board, and surface to success, so long as you can stay on that. So I have some street cred in wave spotting. PayPal, circa 1999, which is a proud presence at this conference, as well as the last up to years now in e-commerce, was something that I started with a bunch of friends, and you can see their glorious faces. The somewhat nerdy-looking guy in the back row is me. And basically what happened is I convinced that guy was the only nice jacket in the bottom corner, Peter Thiel, that mobile commerce is going to be it. It's going to be totally huge. It was 15 years too early, and mobile commerce that I thought was going to happen looked like the phone on your left, although it took a while to get to the phone on the right. Although now that hopefully everyone in the audience is completely convinced that Apple Pay is going to make all the difference in the world, maybe I wasn't so wrong. So on to my trends. So beneficence is a real word. You can look it up. It comes from specialized language used in ethics of psychological studies. It's pretty cool. And you're probably thinking beneficence, maleficence. That's not beneficence. That's a Disney movie. But beneficence is actually pretty easy to explain. It's an act of doing good, act of kindness. And the idea in psychology and experimentation around psychology is that if the researcher is beneficent, they will not perform the experiment unless they are completely convinced, persuaded that it is good for the subject. It isn't just an experiment. It's basically the idea of the other side taking a position, taking a stance, only acting in good faith. Seems kind of obvious, but there's a lot of examples of not. So I'll show you a video since it's the last keynote. I can do whatever I want.
Go on, Stanley.
I got a $100 check from my grandma, and my dad said I need to put it in the bank so it can grow over the years.
Well, that's fantastic. A really smart decision, young man. We can put that check in a money market mutual fund. Then we'll reinvest the earnings into foreign currency accounts with compounding interest, and it's gone.
What?
It's gone. It's all gone.
What's all gone?
The money in your account. It didn't do too well. It's gone.
What do you mean? I have $100.
Not anymore, you don't. Poof.
Well, what can I do to get back
I'm sorry, sir, but this line is for bank members only.
I just opened an account.
Do you have any money invested with this bank?
No, you just lost it all.
Then please stand aside for people who actually have money with us. Next, please.
So it gets better from here, but even though it's probably recorded, but off camera, as far as live feed is concerned, it gets pretty much unprintable. But the point here is pretty profound. So this came out in 2009. This is obviously a post-08 crash response in the popular media to the common sentiment around big banks. People have already read or heard of the too big to fail. They're profoundly disappointed in the position that the big banks took after the real estate bubble was burst. And the government basically took out at this point, 8-year-long, multi-billion-dollar negative advertising campaign against big banks. This is like the single worst anti-branding campaign ever created. You have CFPB established, Elizabeth Warren. You have this powerful force of negative publicity around how badly big banks treated their customers. This is kind of the beating into the minds of everyone who's willing to listen that they were the exact opposite of beneficent. And so the reason it was so powerful, the reason the sentiment of too big to fail hasn't budged, the reason these banks are still perceived as kind of the opposite of beneficent is because of social media. And the idea, the sort of pragmatic reason to be good, to act in beneficent nature, isn't just because it's the right thing to do, because it's kind of good for humanity, but also because between the companies like Yelp and TripAdvisor and all these different social rumor mills, essentially, from Twitter to Facebook to BuzzFeed, any misdeed doesn't just not go unpunished, it gets amplified. It gets told to friends by friends, and soon enough it becomes a scandal. And so the notion of transparency has gone radical way, way, way to the nth degree. And here's your proof. So in the last 8 years, the continual survey of millennial customers, and we'll get to the millennial demographic in a second, but they are the single largest buying force in America at this point, and the one behind them is going to get even larger, basically routinely cast among the top 10 brands they dislike actively for leading American banks. So you have this enormous compounding effect from what one could have considered a sensible business decision to cut someone's credit line during the tougher times on their balance sheets. So some examples of beneficence, since I spent a lot of time telling you how not beneficence, what maleficence looks like. So there's a whole bunch of these. The most kind of great dead-on example is CVS. So CVS didn't just stop selling cigarettes in every one of their stores. They actually took out a huge marketing campaign saying, yep, we're going to sacrifice this big slug of revenue. It's very profitable. It's not expensive to make cigarettes. We're going to not do it. We just don't think it's healthy. They rebranded the entire company around the notion of we are for health, and so we won't sell you things that aren't good for you. We're going to be prescriptive instead of neutral, which is a huge new shift. The other one, this is always probably controversial to say in Vegas, but Apple, a few years ago, decided to pull all sexually suggestive or potentially pornographic considered applications, basically as a strong statement around what they will and will not stand for. It's their platform, they can do whatever they want, but the message they wanted to make ultimately is we are pro-parenting. These are kids' devices. If you ever heard your iPad referred to as the electronic babysitter, Apple felt that to fulfill on that claim, they had to have made it a perfectly safe space, and that was the move. There's lots of other examples, some of the logos here, but I'm sure you can probably think of a couple of these yourself. Interestingly enough, beneficence at this point has been proven to be accretive. CVS gained market cap. Apple doubled their market cap since the sexually suggestive apps were removed. So it is not really a controversial trend. I just thought it would be good to give it a name. Moving on to trend number 2, software eating older software. So there's a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. All of you are probably familiar with his tweet storms. Mark Andreessen at some point wrote, I think, a tweet storm that became an essay. I'm sure it'll soon become a movie. Software eating everything, where if you had an analog system, an analog process, something that was done inefficiently, it is now going to be abstracted from some rudimentary hardware into software, and software can be repaired, replaced, iterated on. It'll be amazing. So software is eating everything. The trouble with software is that even though it doesn't rust, it builds on itself. And it can be very hard to replace. This is actually not software, it's hardware. It's the Mumbai Telephonic Exchange. Today, it looks probably pretty much like the Mumbai Telephonic Exchange roughly 100 years ago when the telephony became a thing. It's just been upgraded a couple of times. So imagine literally untangling that and turning it into something modern. And so the point of the software eating software trend is that even though you think you are up to date, you are extremely modern, just like this beautiful advertisement for IBM was in the 70s, your software is probably desperately outdated. And it is the very thing that prevents you from upgrading your software. And most sort of this is less retail and more universal, but banking, government, healthcare, all these systems that are now seen as desperately outdated, impossible to upgrade, horribly awkward, were all on the very forefront of adoption of computing less than half a century ago. If you sit down with a bank president today of any top 4, top 10 American banks, straight up from that most hated list, they will tell you that they are the most modern, most amazing software systems, and they have the best software engineers, and you Silicon Valley whippersnappers have no hope because we got software like you haven't seen it. I have seen it. It looks like this. I have personal experience in the matter, a story that never fails to amuse. My mom and I learned how to write code at exactly the same time in a government job, and she still does. And her software engineering skills are uniquely suited to do this because that's when she learned how to do it, and she still does. There's plenty of jobs available for people that know how to run this. At this point, it's not a green screen thing, but it's might as well be green screen. And so this software is what prevents systems from looking like this. So as an investor, it's always exciting to look at opportunities where analog is transforming into digital, but reality is the biggest bottleneck and therefore opportunity, and something to consider within your own companies, is a transformation from outdated digital into digital that is actually modern. So it's more of a warning perhaps, but so this is a very cool retail technology that is just starting to gain traction. To me, this is the first use case scenario for augmented reality. Look at yourself in a mirror and see what you look like, augmented with new look, new clothing, new jewelry. That's really cool. If the CRM behind it sucks, or the payments gateway doesn't work very well, or anything that you thought was really rockin' in 1999, it's probably worth paying a lot more attention to that. This has a couple of users and might have a couple more in the next 2 years. Your CRM is every one of your users, and it just somehow always gets the second look. On to trend number 3. So I decided to throw in an extremely fancy sounding title, mostly to keep people awake in the last third of the presentation. But it's actually not a complicated idea. It's the fact that the market, especially on the internet, has gotten so large and so complex that despite the advice that you normally give, that go for the biggest market, go for the biggest opportunity, land grab, sort of all the Silicon Valley dodges, I actually believe the time has come to dig as deep as possible to understand your customer to the deepest possible level. And the reason for the fractal moniker here is that inevitably, because the internet is so pervasive, because sort of the transformation has fully happened, it's completely global, there really isn't a place in the world without e-commerce, frankly. The more you dig into the narrowest niche you found for yourself, the more you discover that it's actually a lot larger, and the opportunities tend to compound to those that go deep as opposed to those that go broad. Good example in sort of our universe here is people like Warby Parker and Casper are these fantastically successful merchants that manage to live in a world of, I would argue, semi-commodity products under the steamroller that is Amazon.com. You basically have this idea that Amazon's opportunity is your margin. How in the world can you sell things like glasses or mattresses that we all understand are generally made by a relatively small number of manufacturers? So as commodity products, it is particularly difficult to live in this world of fully centralized commerce, Amazon, Walmart.com, et cetera, and yet they succeeded. they're successful because they focused so deeply, I believe anyway, on the customer, on understanding of every little tiny detail of every process, that they're able to reinvent vast majority of the business. They started looking at brick and mortar as essentially a trial space. They fundamentally changed the way they look at economics of the brick and mortar store vis-a-vis online fulfillment, et cetera. So you can think of this as kind of, well, they built a brand, so what's the big deal? I actually think it's a lot more than that. I think the fundamental thing that underlies their success is the idea of attaching metrics and extremely detailed understanding of the customer in a quantifiable sense well before they get to real scale. It is always tempting to say, you know what, I don't care about measuring my customer success or my conversion rates. I only have 3.5 people going through every day. I don't think so. I think the new reality is that if you dig super deep into the smallest details of your business, inevitably you find a tremendous amount of information that starts shaping your strategy. And it's a little bit dangerous to lose the forest for the trees because the trees are so interesting. But as often as not, when I talk to retailers, I find that they still live in this very holistic view, as they call it, of the trees that doesn't have a whole lot of forest behind it at all. So back to my favorite generation, the Millennials, of which I sadly am not one, but just so. So there's 80 million of them. It's a 33% of all American spend by 2020, and 60% don't use credit cards. It's kind of a staggering stat. There's actually an interesting wrinkle to it. It's not that 60% don't have credit cards. It's that 60% either use debit cards or use credit cards as if they're debit cards. In other words, they get the grace period and they pay it off at the end of the month. So this fundamentally changes their shopping habits. And this is a direct, of course, outcome of the first trend, or the inverse of the first trend. As big banks got their negative publicity firmly entrenched in this generation's heads, the natural response was, well, you can't trust them. They screwed my parents. I was a teenager when we lost our house. I am not going to let this happen to me. Debt is bad. And of course, debt's bad, and you can live a cash flow lifestyle until you need your first mattress from Casper. But it's going to be pretty hard to buy if your excess spread is somewhere north or south of $1,000, which is roughly the price point here. The last two stats are not actually millennials. The reason they're in red is because they're kind of scary sounding, but also because they apply to the entirety of America. Basically, 55% of Americans, and this skews more in a millennial demo, live effectively a cash flow lifestyle. You don't actually have enough capacity to do more than an extra $400 worth of emergency expenses. Again, in a world of beneficence, this should be something that asks you the question, begs the question, well, how do you adjust selling? How do you adjust retail in view of these facts? Now, on the other hand, sort of stop with the cold water and get back to why we're all here, you have to unlock new populations of consumers, new populations of shoppers. You need to turn window shoppers into buyers. You know, that's essential to what we all do here. I think it goes back to metrics. I think fundamentally it's the question of how do you understand your customer? How do you provide them with the opportunities to buy that fit the progressively more complicated financial realities that I just outlined, but also essentially how do you do this where you answer this trend number one, beneficence? Because if you don't, you're going to wind up in this top 10 most hated brand list. So since I am the last speaker and I have 2 minutes left, I will shill for my own company for 5 minutes or less. 5 minutes, close enough. I'm one of those people who firmly believes that those who can't teach. And so before I decided to disclose these powerful trends, I started a company called Affirm, built on these ideas. We basically wanted to reinvent shopping and credit and banking, not just to not be in the top 10 most hated American brands, but speak to this newfound transparency, demand for simplicity, demand to be beneficent in the world of finance. We built our own FICO score, and we did a lot better than a FICO score. You can see that's the chart of how many more people we let through the door when they apply for credit. And then we partnered with point-of-sale retailers, online and now offline, where we essentially said, instead of a credit card, instead of a tired, old, anti-beneficent payment method, we're going to offer one that is, in fact, crystal clear, has no complexity, no gimmicks, no retroactive interest, none of all the things that people that choose to opt out of credit cards are effectively protesting against. Basically looks like this, if you want an example, and essentially allows you as a retailer to offer an installment plan for your millennial shopper at the point of sale, instantly, without a new card, with simple interest, extreme transparency. It works pretty phenomenally well. We have pretty unbelievable metrics, except they're believable because they've been all third-party verified. This is less about pounding the table how you should all partner with Affirm, although you should absolutely partner with Affirm as soon as possible. It's more about that what used to be true, that you can kind of sort of do what's right for you and not be caught hurting the customer or being in an ambiguous position vis-a-vis the customer's long-term success, long-term goodness. I think it's no longer an option. I think every company has to try to wind up in the beneficence rubric. And banking, obviously an industry that I came from many years ago, is something that has a particularly open field of opportunities to disrupt. But in retail, we're right there. We have to offer people ways to shop that don't destroy the personal financial well-being. We need to give them choices. We need to give them transparency. That's what I'm trying to do. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Max. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our keynotes.